You've been told the British Raj was held together by redcoats and railways and a kind of smug administrative genius, like the empire was this unstoppable machine, and the people under it were just background. Silent, managed, contained. No other channel will tell you this, but History Finance File will. One of the nastiest threats to that machine in Bengal wasn't a rebellion with muskets. It was a plant. A small green crop that turned into a blue stain on European cloth and a black mark on the colonial balance sheet. Indigo. The dye that made Britain's textile profits pop, while Bengal's peasants quietly got turned into collateral. And before you roll your eyes, a dye almost collapsed the Raj. Listen, not collapsed like a palace exploding in one night. Collapsed like a system losing its grip, losing its legitimacy, losing its ability to extract without consequences. Because empires don't just die from bullets. They die when extraction stops working. When the people they're squeezing learn the simplest weapon in the world, refusal. Here's the myth. Indigo was just commerce. Just a crop, a business arrangement. Buyers, sellers, contracts, everyone consenting because that's how markets work. On paper, it looked harmless. A peasant receives an advance. The peasant grows indigo, the planter buys it. The exporter ships it, British industry dyes cloth, everyone wins. Cute story, but here's the part they don't teach you. The advance wasn't help. It was a hook. It was a debt trap. And once the hook was in, the rest was force. Legal force, economic force, and sometimes the kind of force that shows up with sticks in the dark. In 19th century Europe, indigo wasn't a quaint folk dye. It was fuel for an expanding textile world, a global fashion and industry obsession for deep, color-fast blue. Academic work on European material culture points out indigo was historically a rare, expensive imported commodity that became increasingly important as industrial textile production grew and imports expanded. And Britain's cotton industry, supercharged by the Industrial Revolution, needed dye the way a furnace needs coal. So the British East India Company, and then the system that followed it, leaned hard into Bengal and Bihar as supply zones. Britannica is blunt about the motive. Feeding the British cotton textile industry led to an exploitative indigo cultivation system in those regions. Translation: Bengal wasn't being developed. Bengal was being configured, rearranged so London could print profit. Now imagine the wealth pipeline. At one end, London auctions, merchants, manufacturers, people buying dyed cloth as status, as uniform, as industrial output. At the other end, a farmer in Nadia or Jessore staring at his best land and realizing he's being pushed, persuaded, compelled to grow a crop that doesn't feed his family because somebody else wants blue. This is where things get ugly, because indigo cultivation in Bengal wasn't just encouraged. Many records suggest it was coerced through contracts that were agreed under pressure, backed by advances that riots couldn't realistically escape. Britannica describes the core pattern. Planters persuaded or compelled riots to sign contracts to grow indigo rather than food crops, often on the best portions of their land, and paid them less than they could earn growing rice or other crops. So the riots couldn't repay advances and fell into a cycle of debt and exploitation. That's not a bad deal. That's engineered dependency. Here's the simple mechanics, because once you see the machine, you can't unsee it. The planter advances money. Sounds helpful, right? But the advance is tied to a contract. The contract forces you to allocate land to indigo. The indigo price you receive is set low enough that you remain short of cash. Then the debt just happens to roll forward, and the debt becomes leverage. The debt becomes permission to threaten, permission to seize cattle, permission to ruin you in court, permission to send men to your village to negotiate with their fists. And the system had teeth. Banglopedia's summary of the Indigo Commission's findings describes planters using lathiels, hired strongmen, to loot and burn houses of recalcitrant riots, seize draft animals, and force fertile lands into indigo cultivation. That's not free enterprise. That's plantation logic wearing a contract's skin. Even British parliamentary debates later referenced what the commission evidence described. Indigo cultivation conducted through a system of advances, some stretching back years, even to fathers and grandfathers, and concerns about coercion and abuse built into those arrangements. Think about what that means. Debt that outlives the person who took it, debt as inheritance, debt as a leash passed down like a family curse. And it got worse because the local power structure could be bent to protect the planter class. In an 1861 House of Commons debate, the commission was cited condemning the appointment of honorary magistrates that included many indigo planters, men effectively positioned to judge disputes where they had direct interests. Imagine being a peasant and realizing the person you're accusing is connected to the person deciding whether your complaint counts. That's not law, that's theater. Now add the agricultural reality. Indigo isn't food. It occupies land and labor that could be feeding families. And when returns are low and pressure is high, the risk isn't just poverty, it's hunger. The revolt didn't erupt because peasants suddenly became ideological. It erupted because the numbers stopped making sense, and the violence enforcing those numbers became impossible to tolerate. So when did the peasants finally snap? In 1859, Barely 2 years after the shock of the 1857 uprising and the formal end of company rule, Bengal's countryside sees something that should make any empire nervous: organized refusal. Britannica frames the start as a nonviolent strike in March 1859 in Nadia district, where riots collectively agreed to refuse to grow indigo, and the movement spread rapidly. Wikipedia and other summaries commonly identify the early leadership around Nadia with Digambar Biswas and Bishnu Charan Biswas, and locate early action around villages like Chalgacha. And the refusal wasn't just emotional, it was strategic. It was peasants learning how to hit the system where it hurts, not by attacking a fort, but by starving the factory of its raw material. Indigo planters could bully individuals. They couldn't easily bully an entire district that decided together, no. Not planting, not taking advances, not playing along. This is where things get ugly again, because the planters didn't respond with polite negotiation. They responded with pressure, private militias, intimidation, retaliation. But the revolt's genius, and the reason historians often treat it as an early template for later mass movements, is that it wasn't only about direct confrontation. It also used social boycotts and legal resistance, turning courts, petitions, public opinion, and collective non-cooperation into weapons. Many accounts emphasize that while violence occurred in some places, much of the movement functioned through organized non-compliance, making it harder to crush without exposing the colonial state's naked brutality. And here's something people forget. An empire can survive riots more easily than it can survive credibility loss. A riot can be called criminal. A mass refusal, especially when documented, starts looking like injustice. That's where the Bengali middle class and the press enter the story like a second front. Because revolts don't just happen in fields, they happen in information systems. Britannica notes that educated middle-class Bengalis supported the riots, and that journalists in Calcutta reported on the harshness of the Indigo system. One of the names that keeps surfacing is Harish Chandra Mukherjee, associated with the newspaper The Hindu Patriot, who is remembered for standing with the riots and exposing planter oppression during the revolt. And then comes the cultural weapon that hits harder than a police baton: Neil Darpan. A play, a drama. A mirror held up to a system that preferred darkness. The Bengali play Neil Darpan, written by Dinabandhu Mitra and published in 1860, depicted the brutal treatment of indigo cultivators. It spread outrage, not because it invented cruelty, but because it put cruelty into narrative. It made the invisible visible. The colonial reaction to that visibility is almost embarrassing. Reverend James Long published an English translation, and he was prosecuted for libel in 1861, fined and briefly jailed, because the planter class and colonial establishment understood what was happening. The story was escaping the countryside. It was reaching the people who financed and politically defended the system. Nothing screams, "We're winning," like putting a translator on trial because the truth is bad for business. Now, pause for a second. If you like this kind of history, the kind where you follow the money and watch the empire flinch, hit like, and subscribe, not because this is inspiring, because it's instructional, because these are the blueprints that keep getting reused. Back to the state response, because this is the moment the Raj realizes it has a problem. When the revolt spread, the Bengal government didn't just send force, it reached for law. In March 1860, the government passed the Indigo Act, which essentially enforced fulfillment of indigo contracts for one season, while simultaneously creating an Indigo Commission to investigate the cultivation system. That's the colonial move in one sentence. Squeeze now, investigate later. But investigations have a risk. If you investigate injustice, you might find injustice, and the commission did. Britannica says the commission's August report was highly critical of planter practices, and affirmed that riots could not be forced to grow indigo. Parliamentary debate in Britain echoed the commission's criticisms, highlighting coercive agreements, fabricated documents, and the moral stain of compelling unprofitable cultivation, with calls that compulsory measures should be abandoned and not renewed. Read between the lines, the empire blinked, not because it suddenly grew a conscience, because the economics became politically dangerous, because coercing indigo in Bengal had become a scandal that threatened administrative stability. Because a peasant strike, amplified by journalists, playwrights, and public debate, was turning a profitable commodity into a reputational liability. And when a system stops being profitable in the full sense, money plus legitimacy, it starts getting reformed. So did indigo almost collapse the Raj? Not in the Hollywood sense, but in the real sense, where the Raj's ability to extract depended on a mix of force and consent, it absolutely landed like a warning shot. Remember the timing. Post-1857, the colonial state was already hypersensitive to widespread unrest. A mass rural movement that combined refusal, local solidarity, media exposure, and legal pressure wasn't just a crop dispute. It was a demonstration. Peasants could coordinate. They could hold the line. They could force the state to investigate its own clients. And once you demonstrate that, you can demonstrate it again. That's why the Indigo Revolt matters beyond Bengal, because it leaves a template. Years later, in 1917, Gandhi's first major satyagraha in India, Champaran, was also tied to indigo cultivators and planter coercion, even though the local system there had its own specific mechanics. The line isn't the same event repeated. The line is, the logic of non-cooperation against forced cash crop extraction doesn't disappear. It migrates, it evolves. It gets a new vocabulary, it becomes national. And here's the final conclusion, the one that doesn't end in celebration, because history doesn't owe us clean endings. Indigo didn't just dye fabric. It dyed the relationship between ruler and ruled. It exposed the Raj's economic engine as what it was, a machine that turned contracts into cages and advances into chains. The revolt showed that the most dangerous threat to a colonial economy isn't always armed rebellion. It's the sudden moment when the people at the bottom stop cooperating with their own exploitation. Because when peasants refuse a crop, they're not just refusing a plant. They're refusing a financial system. They're refusing a debt. They're refusing an empire's right to write numbers on their lives. And once that refusal becomes imaginable, once it becomes organized, the empire can still survive for decades, sure. But it survives differently, more afraid, more exposed, more dependent on managing appearances. The blue dye keeps shipping, the ledgers keep balancing, the officials keep smiling, but the countryside remembers. And the next time the empire asks for obedience, the answer isn't automatic anymore, it's negotiable. And that is how the Raj began to crack one blue harvest that never came.
And if you want more videos like this, click here.